Have you ever faced like a really complex issue, maybe a pile of information, and just wanted to somehow cut through all the noise to really get to the core arguments, understand the nuances, and maybe, form a really solid, well-reasoned view? Well, that's exactly the journey we're starting today. This deep dive is all about sharpening up your critical thinking and how you communicate that thinking, especially when we're looking at a topic that, well, it affects almost everyone these days, the huge impact of e-commerce on retail businesses. We're going to explore how you move beyond just, listing facts, how to actually build an argument that's logical, critical, and really persuasive, not just describing things.
Yeah. And our guide for this is actually a fantastic framework from Mr. G, who's a business teacher.
Yeah.
He lays out this really practical step-by-step approach for building strong arguments, like in essays, but it applies much more broadly. We'll use his method as a kind of lens to really unpack this e-commerce question.
And we'll keep focused on that one big question throughout. Evaluate the impact of e-commerce on retail businesses. I mean, it's a topic that touches every retailer in the UK, right? From the little corner shop right up to the huge high street names. It's a perfect real-world test case.
Absolutely. And our mission isn't just to sort of learn the framework itself.
Mm.
It's more about using it to pull out those really important nuggets of knowledge about e-commerce, too.
Mm.
So hopefully give you a shortcut to being, well-informed on this vital subject and also better equipped to think critically about, well, pretty much any topic.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning then. Before we can really dissect something complex, we need that solid foundation. Clarity first. So what's the absolute crucial first step? Setting the stage for a strong argument.
Right. The foundation, it's all about being precise. You have to state your point really clearly. And especially in a business context like this, use business-focused terms.
Hmm.
Vague statements, they just don't really cut it.
You hear those all the time about e-commerce, don't you? General stuff.
Exactly. To make a real impact, you need that precision. So for our e-commerce question, a strong statement might be something like, e-commerce allows businesses to reach a wider market.
Yeah.
See? Simple, direct, and totally relevant.
Okay, got it. A clear point, straightforward, concise. But just stating it isn't really enough, is it? How do we build on that? Make sure people really get what we mean, especially, the implications for e-commerce businesses.
Exactly right. The next vital step is to explain your point. This is where you show you actually understand the business concept underneath. You show what that statement means in practice for these companies trying to navigate the digital world.
So, if e-commerce lets businesses reach a wider market, well, you explain that means they're not just limited to local customers anymore. They can attract national buyers, maybe even global ones, through their website. It fundamentally changes their potential customer base.
Right. And how do you signal that explanation clearly? Using connective phrases really helps guide the listener. Things like this means or as a result, perhaps, which allows. And you should definitely anchor your explanation to proper business concepts. Explicitly mention market reach or customer base expansion.
Yeah.
It just deepens it beyond description.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about making it real? How do we show the tangible effects?
Real-world examples are absolutely vital here. Think about Tesco, for instance. They use their online platform to sell groceries right across the UK, reaching people miles away from any physical store, or maybe John Lewis. They showcase products nationwide online. And that's been particularly crucial for them recently with some of their physical store closures. It shows how e-commerce helps them stay competitive, keep their customers, even when the high street is changing. It's not just convenience, it's strategic survival sometimes.
So it's precision first in the statement, then being crystal clear and explaining what that actually means for a business, and then grounding it with real examples. That clarity at the start, it really does set the stage, doesn't it? Provides a strong base for digging deeper.
Absolutely.
Okay, so with that foundation, what we're talking about and what it means in practice, we can now start to, well, really dig deeper. This is where the thinking starts to get interesting, I think. Moving from just describing to analyzing. So how do we really show the quality of our thinking at this stage? What does analysis involve?
Right. This is where analysis comes in. It's definitely not enough to just make a point and explain it. You need to break it down further, ask those deeper questions, show the cause and effect links. You almost have to think like a detective, uncovering the hidden connections.
Deeper questions like what, specifically?
Well, things like, why does this actually matter? How does this work in practice for e-commerce specifically? Who really benefits? And maybe who gets left behind? When is this impact most significant? Or under what conditions might it be stronger or weaker? And crucially, What are the pros and the cons of this specific point? It's that constant questioning that builds a logical chain of reasoning. It takes you way beyond the surface level.
Okay, let's try that with our e-commerce example then. How would we analyze that idea of reaching a wider market? Go beyond just more sales.
You build that logical chain of reasoning, as Mr. G calls it. So if e-commerce allows businesses to reach a wider market, your analysis might continue like this. This wider market doesn't just increase potential sales revenue,
Hmm?
but crucially, it might enable the business to achieve economies of scale.
Right, economies of scale. Maybe just quickly explain that.
Sure. Basically, the more you produce or sell, the cheaper each individual item becomes to produce or handle, on average. Think bulk discount, but for your whole operation. So higher sales volumes let firms spread their fixed costs like rent or website maintenance over more units. That reduces the average cost per unit. And that, in turn, can significantly boost profit margins. It changes the whole efficiency of the business.
Okay, that makes sense, but it's easy to just focus on the upside, isn't it? The benefits of a wider market. What about the flip side? What challenges does that bigger reach inevitably bring?
That's a brilliant question because really good analysis always looks at the other side of the coin. It has to be balanced. So you might continue your argument with a counterpoint, something like,
Yeah.
however, reaching that wider market also exposes the business to much, much greater competition.
Hmm.
Because online, customers can compare prices globally in seconds, not just look at shops down the road.
Mm.
And the impact of that is critical. This could really reduce the business's pricing power and put downward pressure on their profit margins, even if their sales volume goes up.
Mm.
You see, you're not just listing pros and cons, you're showing the inherent tension in the situation.
Got it. And what are the tools, the language we use to build these logical chains and signal that we're doing this kind of critical thinking?
Connectives are definitely your best friend here. Phrases like, which means, as a result, this leads to, consequently, and crucially, however.
Mm.
They're essential for linking your ideas and showing how one thing leads logically to another. Each link should deepen the analysis. And just like with the explanation stage, always try to tie it back to strong, real-world examples.
Right, right.
Well, think about Amazon in the UK. Their ability to sell to millions creates these massive economies of scale, right? Allowing for competitive prices, fast delivery. But at the same time, you see smaller online retailers really struggling. They often can't compete with Amazon's prices or their super efficient delivery network. It perfectly highlights that fierce competition that a wider market creates. It shows both the empowering side and the really challenging side, depending on who you are.
So analysis is really about taking that initial point and just meticulously breaking it down, showing the cause and effect, considering multiple angles. It makes the argument logical, critical, and it really demonstrates that depth of thought. It's not just what you say, but showing why it matters in all its different facets.
Exactly. That depth is key.
Okay, so we've stated our point clearly, we've explained what it means, and we've analyzed its implications, building those logical chains. But, the real world isn't always neat and tidy, is it? An impact on one business might be totally different for another. This sounds like where we add another really crucial layer, evaluation, understanding the conditions, the context. That changes everything. How do we step up to that?
Evaluation is precisely that step up. It's about moving beyond just analysis, to actively consider both sides, yes, but also to weigh up the significance of points. And crucially, bring in the conditions that affect how far your argument actually holds true. It forces you to ask those really nuanced questions. Look, does this apply universally to every retailer? Oh, under what circumstances might the impact be greater or maybe smaller? It's fundamentally about recognizing that impacts aren't uniform. The retail landscape is incredibly diverse.
So context really is king here. E-commerce just doesn't have a one-size-fits-all effect. How do we show that kind of conditional thinking in our argument?
Yeah, that conditional thinking is absolutely the heart of evaluation. So you might write something like, well, e-commerce can help businesses reach a wider customer base. The actual benefits depend significantly on the business's resources.
Okay, and how would you illustrate that?
Well, you'd compare. You could say, look at large retailers like Tesco or Amazon. They can afford massive investment in logistics and sophisticated tech that allows them to serve that wider market effectively, profitably. However, there's a key evaluation word. Small independent retailers might really struggle. They often lack those economies of scale. They face higher delivery costs per item, which can seriously reduce their profitability, even if they are reaching more people. So that initial benefit, less impactful for them. You're making a clear comparison, showing different outcomes.
That makes total sense. The impact isn't universal. It really depends on the business itself. Are there other angles we can use for evaluation, especially thinking about e-commerce?
Oh, definitely. Another really powerful angle is weighing up short-term versus long-term effects. That adds a time dimension. For example, you could argue that in the short term, moving into e-commerce often demands really heavy investment. Websites, payment systems, stock management, delivery, it's expensive. And that can significantly strain a business's cash flow, maybe even hurt initial profitability.
Right. Big upfront costs.
But then you evaluate the long term. However, in the long term, those retailers who adapt successfully, who make those investments wisely, they can achieve sustainable growth. They can build strong customer loyalty online, maybe even open up new revenue streams, especially as shopping habits here in the UK continue that rapid shift online.
Okay, so what are some good phrases, those connectives again, that signal we're evaluating? How do we make it obvious we're weighing things up, comparing?
Yeah, to really flag that you're evaluating, use phrases like depends on, or to a greater extent, maybe less significant if, in contrast.
Yeah.
And definitely those time-based ones. In the short term, in the long term, and of course that classic evaluation connector, however. These are critical for showing you're not just describing anymore, you're making judgment about relative importance and impact. You're acknowledging complexity.
Can you give us a real-world example that illustrates that kind of evaluation?
Marks and Spencer's actually a great, if perhaps slightly painful example. They had such a strong brand, a loyal customer base, right? But they were notoriously slow, some would say, to really adapt their e-commerce strategy effectively.
I remember that.
And the result, they lost significant market share over the years. While rivals, Next, ASOS, they built much stronger online platforms much faster and really captured that digital space. It shows so clearly that the benefits of e-commerce aren't automatic. They really depend heavily on how well and how quickly a business adapts its strategy. That's pure evaluation.
So evaluation is about spotting those conditions, comparing different contexts, weighing up what really matters most for different businesses at different times. It takes an argument from just being analytical to being balanced, critical, and honestly far more convincing.
Precisely. It adds that layer of sophisticated judgment.
Okay, we've stated, explained, analyzed, and evaluated. We've built strong arguments, considered the nuances, the conditions. Now for the final stage, the one that apparently turns a good argument into an excellent one. Justification. This sounds like where we really plant our flag, make our definitive statement.
Justification is exactly that. It's about answering that ultimate question. Okay, after all that analysis and evaluation, why does your argument matter most? It's not enough just to present both sides anymore or say, it depends. You need to show which argument, which factor carries the greatest weight and why. This requires clear judgment backed up by all the reasoning you've done. You're moving beyond it depends to making a really definitive supported claim. That's the peak of insightful thinking.
So we're really stepping off the fence here, aren't we? Taking a clear, well-reasoned position, informed by everything we've discussed about e-commerce.
Exactly. You're giving a clear decision, but it has to be backed by logic. You can't just state an opinion. So for instance, after weighing up all the pros and cons for retailers, you might conclude something like this. Overall, while yes, small retailers face significant challenges moving online investment costs, intense competition, the sheer dominance of digital shopping now in the UK means that adopting e-commerce isn't really an option anymore. Quote, it's become an essential strategic imperative. Consumer behavior has shifted decisively towards online convenience, so the benefits of investing in a solid e-commerce strategy ultimately outweigh the costs and risks in the long run for most retailers aiming for sustainable growth. See, that's a clear, justified position built on the previous assessment.
Okay, that's a strong statement, but how do we really reinforce that justification? Make it undeniable, really compelling?
You can significantly strengthen it by linking back to relevant business theory and also powerful real-world evidence.
Theory, like what?
Well, you could bring in something like Porter's 5 Forces. It's a classic framework for analyzing competition. Here, the threat of substitutes is huge, right?
Yeah.
Customers can easily switch from high street to online, and the intensity of rivalry online is fierce. So, firms that fail to adopt e-commerce risk losing market share simply because the competitive forces demand it. Or you could link it to concepts like achieving competitive advantage through digital, understanding market trends, the strategic need for economies of scale online. These help explain why one factor outweighs another.
And the real-world evidence.
Well, think about that stark contrast again. Look at ASOS, built entirely around e-commerce from day one, captured a massive chunk of the online fashion market. Compare that with, say, Debenhams, a traditional giant, but they failed to adapt quickly enough to the digital shift, and ultimately they collapsed.
A very clear contrast.
Exactly. Those contrasting stories powerfully justify why embracing e-commerce isn't just a nice-to-have, it's often essential for survival, let alone success in today's retail world.
And what are the key phrases, the language that signals we're making this final judgment, showing we're taking that stand?
Use words that clearly show judgment and decision-making. Phrases like, therefore, or this makes it more important because, definitely in the long run, the most significant factor is, or simply, ultimately.
Yeah.
These tell your listener you're making a clear, reasoned decision. You're not leaving them hanging. You're providing that definitive takeaway.
Right. Okay, so we've gone through the whole process. Stated, explained, analyzed, evaluated, and finally justified. We've built this really robust, layered argument. How do we wrap it all up? Present it powerfully, leave that lasting impression, make sure all that hard thinking really lands effectively.
This is where the introduction and the conclusion become so important. They act like the bookends, framing your entire argument. They ensure it starts strong, grabs attention, and ends with real impact. They're your first and last chance to impress, really.
Okay, so what makes a strong introduction then? One that hooks the listener and sets the stage well for a complex topic like e-commerce.
A really good introduction should probably do three key things. First, show you understand the question, provide context, acknowledge the complexity. Second, it should briefly outline the key issues or debates you're going to explore, give a kind of roadmap. And third, it needs to set out a clear direction for your argument. Hint at the main position or the area's assessment you're going to focus on.
Could you give an example for our e-commerce question?
Sure, a strong intro might sound something like this. E-commerce has, well, fundamentally reshaped the entire global retail industry. It's dramatically expanded customer reach, yes, but also intensified competition and completely altered cost structures. However, the extent of its impact is really nuanced. It critically depends on factors like a business's size, its resources, and maybe most importantly, its strategic adaptability. This discussion will evaluate both the profound opportunities and the significant challenges that e-commerce presents for UK retail businesses, ultimately assessing its absolutely indispensable significance for long-term survival and growth. See how it gives context, flags the key issues, and signals the overall direction without just repeating the question.
Yeah, that sets it up nicely. And then how do we land the plane? What makes a really strong conclusion that summarizes the deep dive and leaves that final impactful thought?
The conclusion is your final chance to really impress. It absolutely must directly answer the question, but with balance and that decisive judgment we talked about. So it needs to summarize the key arguments briefly, show that balance by acknowledging the complexity, the double-edged sword idea perhaps, and then deliver a clear, definitive judgment. Your overall position, no sitting on the fence here. State your final, reasoned assessment.
Can you give an example conclusion for our topic?
Okay, something like, in conclusion, e-commerce undeniably represents a double-edged sword for retailers. It provides these unparalleled opportunities to expand markets, maybe achieve economies of scale. But it simultaneously exposes firms to intense, often global competition and demands significant ongoing investment in tech and logistics. Ultimately, its net impact, whether it's transformative or destructive, depends entirely on how effectively and proactively a business adapts its entire strategy. For the vast majority of UK retailers today, from established giants like Tesco to purely online players like ASOS, investing in a robust, evolving e-commerce strategy is, well, it's no longer optional. It's an absolute essential for long-term survival and sustained competitiveness. That brings it all together, shows the balance, but ends with a clear, strong judgment.
Perfect. Together, those introduction and conclusion bookends really ensure the whole argument is polished, confident, and complete. Guides the listener right through. Wow, what a journey that was. From just a simple statement all the way to a really nuanced, well-justified argument, we've really mapped out the course for building compelling insights, haven't we? Especially on a topic like retail's future.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And what's really key here is that these aren't just, academic skills for writing essays. If you think bigger picture, these principles, stating clearly, explaining fully, analyzing deeply, evaluating conditions, and then justifying your conclusion, they're crucial for understanding any complex topic you come across, for making informed decisions, whether personal or professional, and for communicating persuasively in, well, pretty much all aspects of life. It's a really powerful framework for clear thinking.